galaxies, supernovae. But for me, the real deep puzzle is what's actually going on inside a black hole.
Right, that ultimate unknown territory.
And it's perfect timing because you, our listener, sent over some really interesting stuff digging into exactly that. So thanks for prompting this deep dive.
Yeah, great material. And it zeroes in on this really fundamental quantum rule, the Pauli Exclusion Principle.
Ah, yes, the rule about identical particles not crowding into the same space, or rather the same quantum state.
Exactly. It applies to fermions, the building blocks like electrons, protons, neutrons. Think of it like assigned seating at the quantum level. No two identical fermions get the exact same seat assignment.
Okay. And this exclusion principle, it's actually super important for stars, isn't it? Like white dwarfs and neutron stars. It stops them collapsing completely.
That's precisely it. It generates what we call degeneracy pressure. As gravity tries to crush these fermions together, the Pauli principle forces them into higher and higher energy states because the lower ones are already full.
Like musical chairs, but with energy levels.
Kind of, yeah. And all those particles being forced into higher energy states creates a really powerful outward push, resisting gravity. It keeps those dense stars stable.
Uh-huh. But only up to a point.
Only up to a point. And that's where black holes come in, and where the listener's material really highlights the central conflict.
Because with black holes, the gravity is just unbelievable. It seems to just crush everything, presumably including this Pauli principle, leading to the idea of a singularity.
That's the classical picture from general relativity, yes.
Yeah.
A point of infinite density where, well, our current physics just stops making sense.
Which is pretty unsatisfying, physics-wise.
Deeply unsatisfying. So the big question we're tackling, prompted by these sources, is how does this fundamental Pauli exclusion principle actually deal with black hole conditions? Does gravity just win and nullify it?
And what does that imply about physics at its limits? If a fundamental rule just breaks?
Exactly. What happens to the rules of matter itself under that kind of pressure? That's what we want to unpack.
All right, so let's build up from that degeneracy pressure idea. You said it props up white dwarfs and neutron stars. Can you give us a bit more feel for how strong that pressure is? Is it like a cosmic pushback?
It's incredibly strong. Think about a neutron star. You've got maybe 1.5 times the mass of our sun packed into a ball, maybe, 20 kilometers across?
Wow, that's dense.
Unbelievably dense. And the only thing stopping it from collapsing further is that degeneracy pressure from the neutrons. All obeying the Pauli principle, refusing to share the same quantum state. They're forced into higher and higher momentum states, creating this immense resistance.
Okay, but there's still a limit. You mentioned it earlier, the Tolman-Oppenheimer-Volkoff limit?
That's the one, the TOV limit. It's basically the maximum mass a neutron star can support using neutron degeneracy pressure. If the collapsing stellar core is heavier than that, maybe around 2 or 3 solar masses, roughly,
then even that incredible pressure isn't enough.
gravity wins. The collapse continues. And according to general relativity, it heads towards forming a black hole and that central singularity.
Right, the point of infinite density. But, as the material pointed out, quantum mechanics throws a wrench in the works. Those fermions are still fermions, even as they fall in, right? Shouldn't Pauli still apply somehow?
That's the core of the quantum challenge. You'd think so, wouldn't you? If it's a fundamental rule, why would it just switch off?
It feels wrong, like ignoring a law of physics just because things got tough.
It does. And considering the implications, if it did just vanish, well, it suggests our understanding of how gravity and quantum mechanics interact is seriously incomplete. You can't just sweep a cornerstone principle under the rug.
Which naturally leads us to needing a theory that can handle both gravity and quantum stuff together, quantum gravity.
Exactly. And the sources touch on several theoretical ideas that try to resolve this, often by getting rid of the singularity itself.
Okay, let's look at those. First up was Planck stars. What's the idea there? Does it directly involve the Pauli principle?
So Planck stars are hypothetical. The idea is that quantum gravity effects kick in really strongly when matter gets compressed down near the Planck density that's an incredibly high density.
Like the ultimate density limit.
Sort of, yeah. And these quantum effects could potentially halt the collapse before a true singularity forms. Now, the material didn't explicitly link it to Pauli, but the underlying concept is that quantum rules, which definitely include things governing fermions like the exclusion principle, prevent infinite compression.
Ah, okay. So it's less about Pauli specifically holding things up and more about general quantum effects preventing the situation where Pauli would be infinitely violated at a singularity. You just don't get the singularity.
Precisely. Quantum gravity provides a repulsive force or maybe a minimum size that stops the collapse short. So you avoid the infinite density problem altogether.
Interesting. Okay, next idea. Loop quantum gravity, LQG. This one sounds like it tackles space-time itself.
It does. LQG proposes that space-time isn't smooth and continuous like we usually imagine, or like general relativity assumes. Instead, at the tiniest scales, the Planck scale, it's actually granular, like it's made of discrete chunks or loops.
Like pixels of reality.
That's a decent analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
And the key consequence for our discussion is that if space-time has a smallest possible unit, a minimum volume.
Then you can't crush matter down to an infinitely small point.
Exactly. There's a fundamental limit to density imposed by the very structure of space-time itself. So again, no singularity. And if there's no singularity, the problem of the Pauli principle facing infinite density just dissolves. The fermions are still there, still obeying rules, just in an extremely dense state within that smallest possible volume.
Okay, that's a really different way of thinking about it. Not just the matter, but the space it's in has a limit. What about the third one, fuzzballs? That comes from string theory, right?
Yes, fuzzballs are a string theory concept, and they offer perhaps the most radical departure from the classical black hole picture, instead of an empty space with a singularity at the center.
It's fuzzy.
Well, it's proposed to be a massive, tangled ball of fundamental strings, the vibrating strings that string theory posits as the basic constituents of everything. The entire region inside what we'd normally call the event horizon is filled with this stringy structure.
So no empty space, no central point.
No central point singularity at all. The fuzzball itself is the black hole. And crucially for us, because there's no singularity, there's no point where the Pauli principle faces that infinite challenge. The matter that fell in gets incorporated into this complex string state, presumably still following quantum rules, including Pauli, within that structure.
So Planck stars, LQG, fuzzballs, they all offer ways out of the singularity, which indirectly suggests the Pauli principle doesn't just get ignored, maybe just operates within a different kind of extreme environment.
That seems to be the common thread, yes.
Yeah.
Avoid the singularity, and you avoid the most direct confrontation with the Pauli principle being seemingly violated.
The material also mentioned Hawking radiation and quantum tunneling. How do they fit into this picture of what's happening inside?
Well, Hawking radiation tells us black holes aren't entirely black. They slowly radiate particles away due to quantum effects right at the edge, the event horizon. This makes them dynamic, not just static prisons.
They evaporate eventually, though over immense timescales for big ones.
Immense timescales, yes. But it shows quantum mechanics is definitely active around black holes. Then there's quantum tunneling, that weird quantum ability for particles to jump through barriers they shouldn't classically be able to cross.
Like walking through a wall, but for particles?
Pretty much. And some physicists speculate tunneling could allow particles to escape from inside the black hole, or at least influence the state of matter deep within. It adds another layer of quantum weirdness, and suggests the interior isn't necessarily a simple, crushed state. How Pauli behaves might be tied into these dynamic quantum processes too.
Right, it's not just a static crunch. There might be quantum escape routes or transformations happening.
Could be. It all points towards a much more complex quantum reality inside than just a simple singularity.
And then things got even more out there with exotic matter and higher dimensions. Those sound really speculative.
Oh, they definitely are. But necessary to explore, you know. If the matter inside a black hole gets transformed into some truly exotic state we've never seen, well, who's to say it would even obey the Pauli Exclusion Principle as we understand it for normal fermions?
Maybe the rules themselves change for that kind of matter.
It's a possibility, however remote.
Yeah.
And the higher dimensions idea. Well, if spacetime has more dimensions than the three spatial ones we perceive, perhaps curled up very small, maybe gravity works differently there, or maybe particles and the Pauli principle governing them operate under different rules within those extra dimensions when crushed into a black hole.
Sure, speculation, but it highlights how little we truly know.
Absolutely. It just throws into sharp relief that the black hole interior is one of the biggest unknowns in fundamental physics.
So wrapping this part up, it seems like despite that immense gravity, the message coming through these different ideas is that the Pauli exclusion principle probably doesn't just evaporate. It's likely still a key player in whatever physics governs that extreme environment.
I think that's a fair assessment. The classical singularity picture looks increasingly unlikely from a quantum perspective. And if quantum gravity resolves the singularity, replacing it with some ultra-dense quantum state or structure,
Then the fermions making up that state would still need to follow quantum rules.
you'd expect so.
Hmm?
The Pauli Exclusion Principle, maybe in a modified form or interacting with other quantum gravity effects, would likely still be fundamental to understanding the structure of whatever exists inside a black hole.
Okay, so let's try and summarize this journey. We started with this tension, gravity crushing everything versus the Pauli principle pushing back.
Right, the rule that keeps fermions apart.
We saw how it works in neutron stars via degeneracy pressure, but classical physics says it fails in black holes, leading to a singularity.
Which quantum physics really struggles with.
But then we looked at alternatives from quantum gravity theories, Planck stars stopping collapse short, loop quantum gravity giving spacetime a minimum size, fuzzballs replacing the singularity with strings.
All finding ways around that infinite density point.
And we touched on quantum effects like Hawking radiation and tunneling, hinting at a more dynamic interior, plus the wilder ideas of exotic matter or higher dimensions potentially changing the rules entirely.
It really shows how our most basic physics laws are pushed to their absolute limits, forcing us to think in really new ways.
It certainly does. Which leads to maybe a final thought for our listener to chew on. What if, against all these theoretical efforts, the Pauli exclusion principle does fundamentally bore out inside a black hole under that immense gravity?
That would be profound.
What would that really mean for matter itself? Could black holes be more than just destroyers? Could they be fundamentally transforming matter into states where our known quantum rules, like Pauli, simply don't apply anymore? Perhaps creating something entirely new, governed by physics we haven't even imagined?
That's a fascinating and slightly unsettling possibility. Not just breaking a rule, but maybe revealing a whole new layer of reality. Definitely something to ponder.